Hey guys, what's up? This is False Bulls 123 and welcome back to my channel. So a few months ago I watched the horror film The Curse of La Llorona. And if you haven't seen it, it's been pretty poorly received. Okay, in fairness, like mixed reviews. For a conjuring-verse film, that's pretty harsh. And I agree with the majority. I fucking hated this movie. Not because it was slow, or the story didn't make sense, or because it was a little racist. I really hated this movie because it was such a disappointment. So, La Llorona as a cultural figure is so fucking dense with meaning. And a movie that is done by a franchise known for its high production value and gothic overtones should have been amazing. I would have loved to see what this movie could have been, but this is just a white man's first jerk-off idea about another person's culture. Like, no offense to Gary Dauberman, but maybe I should be surprised that a man who's written a lot of fan fiction about white supremacist Charles Manson might not have the most cosmopolitan view on race. So, I want to talk about it. Like everything on this channel, I want to really explore the themes and ideas of it. Like, who the hell is La Llorona? Where did I get this idea that colonialism is a thing in folk horror movies? And also, I just want to shit on this film. Yeah, 5-minute hate is shitty and toxic, but maybe through that anchor we can get to some of the deeper ideas about this. So let's begin with a classic, exhaustive look about something that I just cannot stand. So, first question, who even is La Llorona? Let's see. Now class and any other students who've popped in, welcome. If you do not know who I am Professor Ezekiel. I am a doctorate here of Divine Studies and Folkloric History. Now I know this is not my normal lecture hours, but I was pressed upon by a sudden opportunity. A dataist of some kind, who went by the moniker False Bulls 123, asked me to deliver a lecture on the Latin American folk figure La Llorona. That he was a documentarian of sorts, and while I did not quite understand his profession, it was something along the lines of newsreels. He also gave me this strange device which you can see here on the stage. He says it can capture video film, and while I cannot quite believe his claims, I have done the good humor of setting it up. For his audience, hello. So class, let's begin. And before you ask, we are focusing on the Mexican tradition. The myth of La Llorona consists of two tales, an origin story and various encounters. The origin story states that sometime in the past, details vary on this account, a young woman married either a ranchero or a conquistador. The young husband decided to divorce her for a new wife, and in a fit of rage and sorrow, drowned her 2 children in a river. It's said for eternity she walked the banks of the river, waiting for her missing children, hence her name, La Llorona, or the Weeping Woman. The encounter myths give an image to this specter. She dresses all in white, her long hair about her face, and in some stories cries tears of blood. She appears only at night by water, and cries out, "Mijos, mijos, donde están mis hijos?" My sons, where are my sons? For those that didn't take the foreign language credit, La Llorona is a common folk character in Mexican folk culture. But to truly understand her origins, we will have to do as we often do in this class, look to the gods. There are a few goddesses here who are relevant to this discussion, but I should mention that the Aztecs were similar to the Egyptians in some ways. They often adopted other tribes' gods into their own pantheons, and many of their stories have multiple, if not conflicting, origins. The clearest parallel is Xiacatl, or Snake Woman. She was a fertility goddess and the patron god of women who died in childbirth. She was said to wear white and have long, dark hair. The other goddess in this discussion is Xicotencatl, who I expect you to remember from our segment on Mesoamerica. She was either the wife or sister of the god Tlaloc, and in the creation myth took upon the mantle of the fourth son. The legend goes that the jealous god, Tezcatlipoca, mocked Chalciotilicue, saying that the people only praised her for she gave them warmth to grow maize. She was nothing in his words but a common whore, seeking attention. Chalciotilicue grew disheartened and wept tears of blood for 52 years, drowning the world in her sorrow. Hence why the fourth son is known as the water sun. The next important part of this legend occurs in the 15th century according to the natural histories written by two monks, which modern anthropologists deem the Florentine and Duran codexes. These tomes refer to a series of 8 omens that occurred to Montezuma II 10 years before the invasion of the Spanish. 2 of these stand out: the 5th omen, which was a flood, and the 6th, in which a woman walked through the town square of the capital, wailing and crying, my child, we must flee from here. My child, where shall we go?" Some sources attribute this cry not to a simple townswoman, but either the goddess Ciacoatl or Coatlicue. Both goddesses were mothers and fertility goddesses, and to further complicate things, Ciacoatl is sometimes seen as an aspect of Coatlicue, so the original intention of these narratives is obfuscated. Some contemporary scholars have compared the visual appearance of La Llorona to similar women in white in European canon, and to the Greek myth of Medea. These interpretations are without merit. There is very little evidence that the Spanish would have been aware of these myths, much less have them as part of their own cultural narrative. While I'm not against comparative mythology, there's a wide gap between exploring the historical origins of the deluge myth and simply performing these kinds of scholastic imperialism. A woman in a white dress is not a unique concept, and while the Spanish definitely influenced the myth, the idea that it was adopted whole cloth as a type of cultural import, if you will, is nothing if not insulting. To fully understand La Llorona's actions, we need to be aware of the caste system that was created in New Spain, after the fall of the Aztec Empire. The main folklore character here is known as La Malinche. La Malinche was a real-life person, but her biography pales to her folkloric importance. The fact that remain between the two is that La Malinche was an indigenous woman, part of the Nahas, who was enslaved by Cortez. She served as an interpreter and as a concubine, bearing him a son named Martin. In some interpretations, she is seen as a powerful woman, a Hispanic Esther who controlled the man behind the throne. In the other, she is a race traitor who gave the Spanish regime the first mestizo, and therefore sealed the fate and fortune of the people with a status system of blood. During the period, there was a dearth of Spanish women in New Spain, and many men married indigenous or mestizo women, often having children with their wives. These women enjoyed some level of status from this arrangement. However, these men were fickle, and would often remarry to a Spanish woman, at best demoting the wife to the role of mistress, and at worst, stripping her of hearth, home, and often child, much like our own history of the assimilation of the American Indian. With this history, you can see how the curious fact of La Llorona marrying a conquistador takes on new light. It also explains the seemingly strange instance of infanticide, as a suddenly twisted retelling of Jochebed. It's also important to understand that La Llorona has taken on political symbolism, much in the same way that the muralist painters did a few decades back, and plays in other folk tellings the conflicting ideas of La Llorona and La Malinche as both a folk hero and villain play out. La Llorona is specified as being either mestiza or indigenous, marrying not just a white man, but a conquistador himself. If you want a more thorough analysis, I would suggest the article The Weeping Woman by essayist Amy Fuller. Talk to Margaret over at Orne, she'll know the one I'm speaking of. The Aztecs believed that the water of the river was the water of the womb, and that one's love for her creation can paradoxically kill it. The history of Mexico is filled with women weeping, and each time it ties to a nation whose conception of themselves and their ethnicity is fraught with social and political expression. Now class, since this was an impromptu lecture, you may turn in a one-page essay about this topic for extra credit. Those that are doing poorly in this class should take me up on such an offer. Anyway, I hope this was sufficient for you, false bulls. Please let me know in the future if you have any more requests for such curriculum. Hey guys, so originally I was going to do this as like sort of a Kenny JD Cells segment. That did not turn out, and so I just did it like, regular webcam. That didn't turn out, so this is the third time recording this section. I'm kind of over trying to roast this movie, but at the same time, I did say this was the roast of La Llorona, and not the critical literary analysis of La Llorona. And so it's kind of like, it's almost as if I have to roast this movie if I put that in my fucking title. Ew. SAO and authenticity? Couldn't be me. Anyway, guys, I'm just going to kind of voice over this screen grab I did of Cuphead. This is my, build, so, roast me in the comments. I'm not good at this game, even though I have beat it. And, okay, where do we begin? So basically the movie starts, and we get this cold open. It's La Llorona, and, what's happening? Who is she? Who are these kids? Why she's drowning them? Whatever. Get a little spooky title font, which we always love, and then we get into the sort of introductory segment of the story. We get this really lovely opening shot. It's a point of view tracking shot. And see that, you'll probably recognize that it's actually an homage to the original Conjuring-verse. So, who's Linda Cardellini? She's a single mom, her husband's dead, she's sad, her kids are sad, and she works as a social worker in LA in the late 70s, early 80s. And so she goes to one of her cases, who is Patricia Valquez, and oopsie doopsie, she made a fucksy wucksy. Patricia Valquez locked her children in a closet. Now, here's some tea. Apparently the police didn't arrest her, as we later find out, which is just so bizarre to me. But moving on. Basically, some more bullshit happens, introduces some characters, and you go to the orphanage at night, and we get the first sort of scare set up. One of the boys is sleepwalking, so they introduce that, and the other brother is, chasing him down these dark, fluorescent-lit hallways, and looking in those, wheelchair mirrors they have in hospitals, the ones for corners. And I do like this scene. I think that Michael Chavez, even though he got a really shitty script, did his best to really do those classic conjuring-verse, horror set pieces. Basically, La Llorona kidnaps the kids, drowns them, La Llorona shit. Hashtag just girly things. And so this is where we get to the first scene that just made me realize how much I'm not going to like this movie. So I'm going to, draw you a picture. Imagine you're a police officer, and you find these two dead boys, in this river culvert. And luckily you were able to identify them somehow, even though supposedly they're undocumented citizens. But, hey, there's these two missing boys from the orphanage. There's some two missing boys that match the description. Okay, whatever. So what do you think your next thing is, now that you've supposedly ID'd this body? I know, let's call this caseworker who was very briefly involved in their lives, and then let's get the mother into police custody. Anyway, you get both of them to come down and just be at the crime scene. You're not interviewing them at the police station. You're not having them ID the body, because of supposedly they're already ID. That's how they knew to call you in the first place. But just have them down there, to plant evidence or intimidate the witnesses or something. So Patricia Valquez literally just pops out and is like, La Llorona murdered my children, gets popped back in. Bye, queen. Go get your paycheck. We'll see you in half an hour. Linda Cardellini proceeds to bring both of her children to this crime scene, which I still can't get over. Girl, your children were asleep. It is late at night. Just let them sleep. They do not need to be in this bad part of town at an active crime scene that is the result of children murder. Who thought that was a good idea? I'm sorry. That's not a good idea, sweetie. They're already latchkey kids, and they're sleeping. I'm just saying. But basically, Linda Cardellini goes to fuck off and, deal with the plot or something, and we get to focus on her two children. Who, I know they are children, and children are, by definition, kind of dumb, but these children are, super dumb. I hate to say it, but, they're not very, good children, half-baked. So this boy is like, oh, I'm in this bad part of town, right next to this child murder scene. I know. The first thing I'm going to do is go for a fucking walk. In, like, this dark alleyway. Okay, King, go off. And as you can guess it, the first thing that happens is La Llorona shows up. And she's like, Mijo, I finally found you. And he's like, Lo siento, mi español no es bueno, so es blanco. And then she grabs him, because she's not there for that bullshit. And he, like, screams, he runs off. You get it, he's, like, scared, he's a ghost, whatever. And this is where we get to a scene where I knew that they should have really hired better children actors. Wow, that sounded bitchy. Oh, well. So, imagine this. You are this young girl, you're like 6 years old or something, and your mother's like, wake up, honey, we're gonna go to the bad side of town to go look at some dead bodies. And you're like, wow, Mom, you should have let me sleep, but okay. So you're sleeping in the car because you're tired, you're like 6, you have school in the morning. And your brother bursts into this unlocked car because your mother is just, apparently, for a social worker, never heard of child kidnappings. And you proceed just to watch your brother, like freak out. Okay, he is injured, he is freaking out, and you're like, bro, chill. And this is where we get to, like, the second horror set piece, which would have been so much better if if the actress actually reacted to the scene, instead of just, like, staring with her useless limbs. So, yeah, it basically comes to, like, this almost hilarious scene, where La Llorona is slowly rolling down the car windows, because it's, like, an old 70s car. And I don't hate that. I actually really, like, I love the idea, but if only, like, both children were, like, part of it, and La Llorona was, like, rolling down multiple windows, and they couldn't keep up with it, you know what I mean? Like, if they had just, like, workshopped it a bit, it would have been amazing. But at this point, it just looks like that one Vine where the kid's like, I have to make my mashed potatoes. So I'm trying to remember how the rest of this happens. Okay. Basically, La Llorona continues to just, like, haunt their ass. And I'm just going to put all of, like, the sort of haunting sections in the same place. So first you get, like, the dumb girl's attack scene, and she's coming home from school. She has her wellies on, she has, like, a rain slicker, she has, like, this clear plastic umbrella, like, honey slayed, like, it's aesthetic. But then, oh no, the wind blew my umbrella into this open underground pool that she just has in her backyard. Why is there not a pool cover? Like, I know it's the 70s, but the more I watch this movie, the more I'm like, maybe Linda Cardellini does need to take a parenting class, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know if Head Start existed yet, but, like, I imagine they had a child's fair where, like, they would talk about children drowning in pools. If you have young children, you need to have a pool cover, because not all of them are going to be confident enough swimmers to survive if they accidentally fall in or something. I'm just saying. But regardless of that, the real monster in this is lack of child safety guidelines. La Llorona attacks, and it's kind of aesthetic. They do this thing like where she's in the reflection and all this, and it wasn't like I said, the effects aren't bad in this film. It's the plot. But this is where we get to, I think it happens later in the movie. I'm just going to put it here because it's thematically relevant. Basically, there's a few other attacks. Like, the whole, like, middle of the film is just, like, her children being attacked by La Llorona. It gets trite. There's some sleepwalking scenes. There's some, like, ones where she's, like, hiding in the curtains, playing hide and go seek. And then there's this one which is really fucking stupid. And I'm pretty sure it happens, like, near the end. But like I said, I'm just doing it here now because I don't want to remember this movie's plot correctly. Basically, the young girl is taking a bath by herself. And, okay, I looked it up, and you can't. And if you're, like, 6 or 8, like, yeah, that's going to be about the age you start doing that. But first of all, she's kind of dumb. Second of all, she's not the most independent person, you know what I mean? And also, it was already established that her mom regularly bathed with her because she would, like, rinse her hair and stuff. And I'm just saying that if you're a kid who doesn't want to rinse your own hair, you're probably not old enough to take a shower by yourself. Just saying. The other big issue with this is that, like, I feel like there's not the correct reactions to La Llorona showing up. You know what I mean? If you are someone who's like, oh, La Llorona is this person that drowns children, I would be like, drain the pool, we're taking showers, I'm not going to let you around large bodies of water, you know, like a responsible parent. But Linda Cardellini is just like,
I'll let my daughter, bathe in this locked bathroom as a 6-year-old child. Surely she wouldn't drown even under normal circumstances, so it's clearly fine when I'm being haunted by a water murder ghost. I'm just saying, maybe Linda Cardellini was a bad mom in this. Basically, she gets attacked, she gets almost drowned, and at this point, they still don't, tell anyone that she's still just being, I'm being haunted by a ghost, ooh-woo. The time that she actually manages to do something about it is when La Llorona basically pushes her kid down the stairs. And so, she drives into the hospital, and this is when we get this. It's not an homage, but it's very reminiscent of Wes Craven's New Nightmare. There's a scene in New Nightmare where Heather Langenkamp has to take her, we have the Babadook at home kid to the hospital, and they think she's beating him or something, and she has to be no, I'm not abusive, it's the supernatural entity that comes in my dreams that is. And I actually really love it in New Nightmare, and I hate New Nightmare, but I love that one scene. And I feel I really like that scene because it speaks to a very real fear that I think a lot of poor and homeless parents have, people that don't have as many resources to give their kids. Because when you are, impoverished, people are a lot more skeptical about your parenting style. They're going to assume a lot more things about who you are. And I think that criticism, that bias also tends to focus on the people that are meant to help you get those resources. So I don't think that it's wrong for them to touch on this film, especially since La Llorona as a story is very much involved with the idea of, the custody of children. But at the same time, I don't like how it's played out in this film, because you take this very real, very nuanced, emotional experience. One where it's you understand why CPS has to be there, but it's still this amount of shame and embarrassment and fear. And they just crank it to an 11, and it really takes a lot of the emotional weight out of it for me. Because you have this coworker that comes along, and she's sorry, I don't want to be here, I don't want to do this, but I need to make sure that you're not a fucking psycho who's beating your kids. And then her, cop friend who was, besties with her husband, when your husband died, I promised to take care of these 2 little whelps, and I need to make sure you're not hitting them, you monster. And, that would be fine, but at the same time, there's no ambiguity in this script, you know what I mean? With, New Nightmare or The Babadook or any of these other films that touch on these types of topics, there's this type of unreliable narration to it. It could be, the result of, insanity, or it could be the result of the supernatural, and it kind of blends at the edges. But here, La Llorona is the one that's been hurting them. You've literally seen her, push kids downstairs and shit. And so, that really takes the, emotional weight out of these scenes. She feels unfairly accused of this horrible thing, as if perfectly normal-looking people don't abuse the kids all the time. But basically that sets up the central tension for, the last third. La Llorona's trying to murder her kids, and also she's making her look like a bad mom. It's not the T-sis, okay? That's not women supporting women, trying to murder their kids. And basically she goes to Father Perez, and he's yeah, I'll let you know about La Llorona. I mean, it's kind of weird you don't know who she is, considering that you live in LA and you mostly work with Latino people, but whatever. My last name's Perez. I have the right background for this. And so he tells her, and really missed opportunity because they basically just reinstate the cold open. I'm still a little pissed off about this because when it comes to movies, having this sort of fable, legend, story type situation, you can really reinforce themes or bring in ideas that you couldn't really organically fold in otherwise. And they don't do anything with it, but whatever. Basically, Perez is I'd like to help you, but I'm Catholic, and the Catholics only deal with, white people demons. Go check out Raymond Cruz, he's a curandero, he'll fix your shit. I actually do like that choice of having a curandero for this story. I think there needs to be some discussion around the fact that there's a lot of cultures that believe in spiritual possession, but we only tend to focus on Western Christian demons. And that tends to have that sort of racial bias in there when there's a lot of religious and spiritual procedures that occur within this, culturally. So I do like that they chose that. I do like that they made that decision. Basically, we get to the exorcism scene, and it's muddled. Let's say with that. There's a lot of stuff that happens, but none of it's really as coherent as I would like it to be. So I'll just tell you the bits that I think were the most stupid. So I'm just going to speedrun this exorcism. Basically, he brings up a bunch of stuff that just kind of feels like they ripped off Season 5 of Supernatural. He blesses an entire pool by making it into holy water, which is as stupid as it sounds. And then Patricia Valacrest shows up because somehow she is still not in police custody with a gun. And a bunch of bullshit happens, and it literally ends with Linda Cardellini taking this random-ass tree cross and shanking her in the heart. That's right. How do you get rid of La Llorona? You stab her with a crucifix. And if that sounds as stupid of an ending as you can imagine, you are correct. So, let's get into more detail now that we've given you a basic rundown of why this movie is dumb. So in the last video, I was critical of the whitewashing in this film, and while I stand by that politically, I think it kind of ignores two assumptions that I made about the war. The first assumption is that this movie was made to represent and be represented by the culture that it's about, and maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe Gary Dauberman was like, actually, this movie is for Margaret in Ohio, who has literally never seen a person of color before. Can't tell, don't know, wrong assumption to make, maybe. The other assumption is a bit more pernicious, and that is that I assumed that Linda Cardellini's race wasn't relevant to the story. I assumed that because whiteness is seen as default, it was meant to be seen as non-symbolic. And 9 times out of 10, I would probably be right. Most of the time, why are they white in movies is because Hollywood has systematic biases and a history of racial exclusion. But I failed to recognize that this movie isn't just horror, but folk horror, which is a genre where race plays a really big issue, especially whiteness. And you're probably thinking, Ryan, what the fuck do you mean? That sounds like some SJW, hashtag milk is racist ass bullshit. But hear me out. So, folk horror was popularized by British filmmakers in the early 1970s, capitalizing on the rise of neo-paganism and folk revival. While it shares some overlap where supernatural horror is more closely akin to gothic or cosmic horror. The monster represents a creative fear in society and represents the emotional journey of the protagonist. Folk horror is often dichotic, whether that be modernity versus tradition, colonialism versus indigenous, or Catholicism versus pagan. And if you're paying attention, you might be noticing a pattern there. I also group folk horror into 2 categories. An outsider story is one where a person from outside of the culture brushes up against some sort of folk experience, whether that be a ritual, a holiday, or even just a small village in the rural countryside. Oftentimes, the outsider is repulsed or frightened by this different way of life, though the story remains fairly neutral. The story often ends poorly for the outsider. They're usually sacrificed or killed in the stories, but not always. However, the fate of the outsider often feels arbitrary. The old ways are like nature. They aren't cruel, just capricious. And most times the outsider was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Category 2. The insider film. Insider stories are less common in the genre, and follow a very different series of tropes. These films tend to be more focused on the diachromatic themes like modernity and tradition, and feature somebody from the cultural background, often somebody who is not completely devout or truly believes in the old ways. The main character often faces an emotional journey, where they have to accept or reject tradition, and it's more common for external forces like dominant religion or westernization to play a larger or more subtextual role. So, where does this leave La Llorona? Well, first, I'd have to classify this as outsider horror. Linda Cardellini is completely removed from the culture, she's initially repulsed by it, and it tries to kill her. I also want to mention that being an outsider film isn't a bad thing.
Candyman uses an outsider to explore issues of race and class from that character's perspective, and The Wicker Man is all about conflicting ideologies and the struggles between collectivism and individualism. However, while I say that, her whiteness isn't something that really affects the story. Cardellini doesn't emotionally grow from the experience, and it's not something that affects the themes. Her children are maybe mixed race, but it literally never comes up. You could basically replace the characters from this movie with any of the families from the first two Conjuring films, and replace La Llorona with the Blood Bride from Annabelle Comes Home, and you would literally have the same story. La Llorona doesn't attack them because they're Hispanic, or because they're the descendants of Cortez or some shit. They're just there, and she wants to drown them, you know? It's her vibe, it's her sis, it's what she's doing this week. And I can't say I love that. It's a movie that builds itself on a narrative canon that asks a lot of really provocative questions about race, about patriotism, about the self and your own identity, and then it adamantly refuses to speak. It's a movie that could have said anything, but chooses to say nothing. Okay, so now that we got that out of the way, let's talk about the real SJW bullshit. I recently wrote a review for Django Unchained, which is a completely uncontroversial film by a completely uncontroversial director. Here's a little taste.
White guilt. I think that's a really big part of the discussion that occurs in white spaces that we don't talk about. Why do I enjoy watching a racist white man get whipped to death by a debonair black man? Can I really say with my full chest that part of it isn't because it others the racism of white people? Are the racists in these movies not an azazel? A subconscious scapegoat that I can cast my own fears upon and watch it be stoned out? Isn't by tacitly approving of this murder, enjoying this killing, that I am distancing myself from the racists, that I am somehow separate from them, that I am one of the good ones?
So there's two different aspects of race here that I want to point out. The first is the text of the script. I am deliberately engaging with my own whiteness. I question how the guilt I feel over America's history of white supremacy affects the way I view the film. My whiteness affects my review. However, my whiteness also affects my view. I made the choice to write about white guilt, about how I hate Hollywood stories like Dallas Buyers Club and The Boy in the Striped Pajama for revising history in a more nefarious way. I chose to write about this instead of the criticism that black people had about the film. In some way, I defended this film, or at least I said I prefer this film to worse ones. Whiteness is something that's a part of myself, something I can engage with. But it's also my bias. It's something that prevents me from truly understanding others' perspectives. So, we talked about the racial subtext of the film, but now I want to talk about the racial bias of the film, of the way that white ignorance has shaped the story. So we've already gone past the whole casting issue and the way that, race deeply ties into the themes of this story. But the part that really got me, the part that made me want to write this section that felt super duper racist, was the portrayal of Patricia Velasquez. So, let's recap her part of the story. When we first meet her, Linda Cardellini is coming over to do a welfare check. She appears on edge, and, oopsie doopsie, she has locked her children in a closet. The scene tells us that she's fanatic, that she's abusing her kids, that she is an unfit mother. And it's important to note that this fit of madness was because of her heathen folk beliefs. The next time we see her in this film, it's this sort of interview scene. She's quietly angry and speaks most of her dialogue in Spanish, which presumably Linda Cardellini doesn't understand. It's here that I really noticed some of the coding of the film. So, let's talk colorism. Colorism is basically a more niche form of racism. Instead of focusing on the broad racial categories, it occurs within racial groups. Specifically, this notion of fairness as better or more desirable.
This also stems partially from the concept of white passing, where light-skinned people are assumed to be white and therefore be given white privilege. Means in media is that people of color who are dark-skinned tend to get chosen for different roles than people of color who are light-skinned. Not always, and it's complicated, but often. What made me think about this was the way that Velasquez is portrayed in this scene. So, Velasquez is a mixed-race woman who has indigenous and mestizo heritage. And it's pretty clear from the way that they styled and lit her in this film that they were trying to evoke that racial coding. They made a purposeful decision to depict her as darker skinned. And it keeps going. They desexualize her character. Her hair is piecey, she doesn't wear jewelry, and her clothing is drab and frumpy. She speaks Spanish, which the characters and therefore the audience doesn't understand, which further otherizes her. She's superstitious and not Catholic, and most importantly, she literally hexes Linda Cardellini. I just want to point out that the two main antagonists of this film are dark-skinned, pagan women. It doesn't quite pass the vibe check. So we can see there's a bit of a bias here, some subtle tropes at work. But the most important thing for me is that her story parallels Linda Cardellini's. Linda Cardellini is also a single mother who's having a hard time supporting her children. Her children are being attacked by La Llorona. She's being accused of child abuse. And halfway through the film, she locks her children in a closet. But see, when Cardellini does it, she's protecting her children. And more importantly, her children don't get taken away from her. Look, there's honestly some good themes here. We could make this work. We have some really good setups, we have some nice, dynamics in this film, but there's never any payoff. Cardellini never thinks about her relative privilege as a middle-class white woman. There's never a discussion about how women of color are seen as less fit to take care of their own children. And maybe this wouldn't be an issue if the cultural history of Mexico and La Llorona wasn't deliberately and specifically about this very topic. This is what I'm talking about when I mean white ignorance. This movie is supposedly about what a mother would do for her children, but it centers a very specific and singular type of motherhood. In other words, this movie is blinded by its own bias, and that prevents it from having a deeper and supposedly more fulfilling conversation. And you might be saying, even if you're right, Ryan, who cares? Why does every movie have to be about race? Gary Dauberman doesn't owe you a flying fuck. He doesn't have to utilize the social and political themes that come with the topic. If he wants to whitewash another person's mythos, that is his God-given right as a white man. I mean an American. You couldn't do better. And you know what? You are partially right there. And maybe you're partially right. No matter how much I want to see diversity and inclusion in stories, it doesn't mean that artists are obligated to write that into their scripts. And being critical about what a film isn't is maybe a dick move. Fair enough. And no, I don't think that every movie needs to be about race. There's plenty of films that are not racialized, and smart cookies will know that good representation involves both central and incidental representation. But it's also kind of the same argument as, why do the queers want to make everything gay? Can't they just be friends? Not that minorities are demanding a pound of flesh and racial quotas or whatever the fuck Tucker Carlson shits his pants to. Oftentimes, it's more about people recognizing the biases that we have in media and asking for a more organic way of telling stories that are not centered on a cishet white perspective. Yes, Samantha, two men can just be friends, but a lot of stories use queer baiting, and oftentimes these characters would be really impactful representation if they were canonized. Think Dean Winchester. He would be an absolute fucking bicon if CW wasn't a pussy-ass bitch. And yes, Andrew,
Gary Dauberman can make as many whitewash stories as he wants, but it's still hurtful that he used his platform and power to write a movie about one of the most iconic Latino folk stories ever, and then chose an outsider to tell the story poorly. Nuestro enojado so único decepcionado. That's the big word here. Decepcionado. Disappointment. I'm upset at this film because it could have been amazing. It could have told a really great story, showcased a bunch of amazing Latino actors, and drew on this rich tapestry of themes and history. It could have been an amazing film, bringing Latino horror to a mainstream audience. But Dauberman was lazy, and he didn't want to write a story. My name is False Bulls Uno Dos Tres, and when I'm not being a filthy SJW on the internet, I'm a cook, a culinarian. I'm somebody that knows what a tournay is, and yes, that makes me better than you. You get it. So, let's talk about food. Cuisine is always in flux. America is heavily influenced by British, Italian, indigenous, and Mexican cuisines, and many of our signature dishes wouldn't be available without indigenous crops like corn and the sugar trade from the Caribbean. It's an art form that is hard to pin down when it comes to appropriation. We wouldn't have salsa torte without the Crusades. We wouldn't have Thai chili peppers without Spanish colonialism, and tempura wouldn't exist without the Portuguese. In some way or another, we borrow, steal, or share the idea of food constantly. That being said, there are lines drawn in the sand. Tonkatsu is not scampolini, is not chicken fried steak, is not Wiener Schnitzel. A dish might be similar, but each one has its own history. Each cuisine has its own philosophy, and a good cook understands the rules, even if he chooses to break them. Appreciation comes from respecting the dish, from understanding where it comes from and the beliefs that food holds. To disrespect the dish, to not fully understand the components and why they are there, is to disrespect the culture. It's to disrespect its history, and to disrespect the people that chose to share it with you. Stories are the same way. A good cook understands his dish, a good storyteller understands his story. And Gary Dauberman, sorry to say, has given us a very disrespectful dish. Anyway guys, thank you so much for watching this video and listening to this horribly in-depth analysis of a film that just was not worth it. I always appreciate you, and I will say that I am working on some more serious essays, but they're taking some time. You know, there's a lot of stuff in the background, and I've been having a really hard time just with life and motivation to really pursue those more in-depth aspects of the production. That's on me. Sorry about that. I will say that I do have a Ko-fi now, so give me money, please. And also, some shit's been going down. You know what's up. So I have posted some charities and nonprofits in the description. Please check them out. Please donate if you can. Anyway guys, that's it. My name is False Bulls 123, and you guessed it, I'm signing out.